Was Paul Bear Bryant's Alabama Crimson Tide the best program in college football in the 60s and 70s? The easy numbers, the surface numbers may say yes. There may be more to the story. Welcome to the Voice of College Football, and welcome to May and the great debate month here at the Voice of College Football. Last night, we argued and debated on the Big 12 and Pac-12 struggle for realignment and expansion. Check out that live stream. It was a lively one, but a very productive and healthy one. Tonight, I welcome our buddy Rick Anaya. You can catch Rick every Sunday night with Tim Prangley on our USC channel as they host Trojan Conquest Live. And Rick also co-hosts our USC postgame during the college football season. And Rick, this is going to be a fun one. We are going to look at the top 10 programs of the 60s and 70s in which most college football fans would believe that Bear Bryant's Alabama Crimson Tide would rank number one.
Yes, Mark, thanks for having me on the show. Hello to everybody. Thanks for tuning in to the Voice of College Football. Great debate month. And Mark, thank you very much for the opportunity to debate this topic with you. I really was inspired by your all-time program rankings last year. And I looked at it and I thought it was phenomenal, all the information you compiled. And, I'm a fan that really came into watching college football at the end of the 70s. And so what I thought I'd do is I would take a look at a 20-year period. Because as you know, there's ebbs and flows with programs, with blue bloods, with all programs over a 20-year period. And so I looked at the 60s and 70s because as the more I dug into it, it was just dynamic. I'm looking forward to sharing that information with everybody watching, tuning in, who's here live in the chat with you, Mark, and get your perspective because this is a debate. And just like you had the debate last night between conferences, there's a lot of things that affect that, primarily television. Television is going to be involved with this as well, but this was pre-ESPN. There was limited television exposure. There's a lot of different conference realignment issues. There's issues revolving around the players in terms of like right now we have transfer portal. Back then, scholarship limitations. So there's a lot of different things affecting. If you just look at the wins and losses, was that team the best? Who did they beat? We use a lot of things like metrics now with the BCS era, with the college football playoff era, looking at strength of schedule. Who did you beat? How many ranked teams? Back then, it was more of an eye test and what we relied on by the AP and UPI polls and the sports writers and the limited TV coverage that we had. And sometimes teams, coaches, players were larger than life. And nobody was larger than life than Paul Bear Bryant down in the South, Alabama. He was so big, they wrote a song about him. There's a lyric by Steely Dan, Deacon Blues. I want a name for the winners in the world. They call Alabama the Crimson Tide. Call me Deacon Blues. So with that, looking forward to starting off to see who was the best team in the 60s and 70s.
Folks, grab those comments and questions, leave them in the live chat, grab your friends, tell them that we are debating college football, 60s and 70s, the greatest program, and we will do all of that coming up next. Most of us are on the internet pretty much all the time. It's fun, you get to socialize, you get entertained, and in this day and age, it's pretty much necessary. And even if you're one of those people that's not on the internet all the time, you know what is? Your personal information. And there are people out there trying to hack you all the time. They want your email address. They want your phone number. They want your place of employment. And they want to do bad things with it. There's also fairly legitimate corporations and companies that want your information. They want it for marketing purposes. They're going to buy it. They're going to sell it. They're going to trade it. At the very least, it's annoying to you. It's a nuisance. It's aggravating. Your email gets cluttered up with spam email. You get robocalls all the time. That's at the very least. At the worst, it's a threat to your family, to your friends, to your personal information, to your banking, to your finances, to your security, to your safety, to your identity. it can be pretty serious. This video is sponsored by Aura. I got hacked and it was pretty obvious. This was about 8 or 9 months ago, and there were red flags all over the place. And I didn't exactly know what to do, but I knew I needed to do something quickly. I mean quickly. I researched 8, 10, or 12 companies immediately. I went all over the place. I asked people. I was online looking for the best company that could serve my needs and secure my information. You know who I found? Aura. And I'm glad I did. It was amazing. I contacted them. They got right back to me immediately. Their customer support is phenomenal. Their customer service is first rate, friendly. They are detailed. They know what they're doing, and they do it right, and they will protect you. In addition to everything I just mentioned, they've got a password keeping service. They keep your credit score. They notify you anytime there's a possible data breach. This has happened to me a number of times. I'm getting notifications all the time when there's a possible compromise to my credit score or anything that I don't want. They've got a VPN that will allow you to browse the internet anonymously. It's amazing. And again, customer service support available 24/7. Click the link in the description section below and get 2 free weeks of Aura. Protect your finances, protect your information, protect your privacy, protect your identity. I did, and I'm glad I did. Aura, thank you so much for what you've done for me, and now for my Voice of College Football community. What is kind of cool about the Aura sponsorship, Rick, is that they approached me a few weeks ago, and I let them know I already used the product. So it was a sponsorship that I could say, okay, I already used the product. The customer service is excellent. I've already been through the process, so I can speak to it directly. So those are obviously the best sponsorships. Everybody leave your comments and questions there in the chat. We will get to them as we discuss 1960s and 70s greatest programs. Rick has compiled a number of lists looking at the top 10 programs in various categories for 1960 through 79. And Rick, we will start to look at the numbers and you can kind of take us through what we have set up here.
Okay, so what I did is I looked at the top 10 teams during that 20-year period, as you mentioned, from 60 to 79, based on winning percentage. And so if you look at it, there was, Alabama was by far the team with the best winning percentage, 85%. The next best was Texas, basically 6% lower, 174, 45, and 4. Ohio State followed. Fourth was Penn State. Fifth was USC. It'll scroll through the next 5 programs. And so
what shows up for me, Rick, is it's pretty inconsequential, the difference between Texas, Ohio State, and Penn State. It's razor close.
Razor thin. So what we're doing here is we're taking a look at, okay, who beat who? Who are the top 10 teams in that 20-year period? And obviously, Alabama sticks out. So we want to take a look at, okay, using the metrics that we do today, kind of strength of schedule. Who did you play? So we're going to compare that as we walk through. How many times these teams played these top 10 teams in this 20-year period. As you see, we're rolling on through Nebraska, 6th. Oklahoma was 7th. Arkansas is 8th. Notre Dame 9th. Michigan was 10th. Just for your information, if you go ahead and I use stats in college football, ASU was technically 8th, but we didn't use ASU because they had only played 3 teams out of these top 10 teams in the last 20 years. They were a WAC member until 1978. So they weren't utilized in this analysis. So Michigan was bumped up. They were technically 11th. I bumped Michigan up. It's kind of like if you take a look at today's 20-year numbers and go from 2000 to 2019, which I think that'll be coming up here shortly. Any guesses out there in the chat who was number 1 in win percentage from 2000 to 2019?
Hurry up and make your guesses. Best winning percentage in college football 2000 to 2019? Boise State.
Okay. So hence, if you look at it, this 20-year period, was Boise State the best team? No. They won a lot of games, but who did they beat and when? And that's why you tuned into the Voice of College Football, because I'm going to let you know who they beat and when. So Boise State played OU, Georgia. You'll see them on there. They were number 3, number 5, and TCU, a total of 10 times. Those 3 teams, they beat 10 times for a 7-3 record. I'm sorry, not those 3 teams, but there's also, they beat Oregon. They beat a couple other teams that were in the top 10 for a 7-3 record. They played 10 teams in 20 years. Not a lot. And so for those reasons, and they were in the WAC and Mountain West, they didn't play the best competition. So therefore, kind of brings on the point, what conference were you in? How many of the best teams did you play? That's an influence. So with that keeping in mind, we're going to move forward, looking back at the 60s and 70s, and checking out, who had the opportunity to play who. There was a lot of different things that were going on, a lot of different rules, such as the number of conference games you played. There were different factors. We'll go into these with the rules in terms of bowl alliances. Back then, you had the AP and the UPI and some other minor voting associations like the Football Writers of America Association and the National Football Foundation that got into voting national championships because there wasn't a playoff. The national champions were voted on by these polls after the regular season and before the bowls. So let's walk through these real quick. Some changes to the game. You came in post-World War II, the GI Bill era. Revenue was driven by the gate until the emergence of TV in the 70s. Really, there was limited television exposure. Yes, the bowl games were on TV, and there was just a limited number of national and regional games that were making money, but not a lot of money like you see today. It was really your home games that were driving the revenue and the agreements that you had in each conference on how much of the gate you got, at a visiting school. 1964 was big because the substitution rule changes. Before you could only have single substitution, this allowed for creating offensive, defensive, and special teams units. It's kind of like the game that we see today. AP poll, they named the champion prior to the Bulls until 1968. And we'll go through what caused that change. There's a lot of changes that happen in college football today. It's because of something that wasn't seen right at the time. They did try it out after the 1965 season because of what happened in 64. They had an experimental year, the AP. And then in 1968, they made it permanent. UPI didn't do it until after the 74 season. And we'll talk about the 73 season that made that happen, as well as a couple of others that created major changes in college football. Notre Dame had a no bowl policy until 1969 because these games were considered as exhibitions by many, and Notre Dame didn't want their student athletes to be out of school any more than they had to, especially if it was considered an exhibition. Big Ten had a no repeat Rose Bowl until the 71 season, and there was freshman eligibility in 72. In 73, scholarship limitations. So you couldn't have, let's say, 110 guys on your team. They got down to the 85 scholarship limitation. They made it a level playing field, so to speak. And then there was a lot of unbalanced league schedules. And what do I mean by that? Every conference, like today, Mark, you have what's the debate between the SEC and, let's say, the Pac-12, the Big Ten, and the Big 12.
What's the debate in regards to the unbalanced schedule is
Right,
obviously the Big 12 has been the only league that everyone plays everyone.
Well,
for one
you have those leagues that have 9 conference games, and then you have those leagues that have 8, like the SEC and the ACC. So that one extra game is like an extra loss, and that can affect your ranking. So we'll get into that. Legendary coaches at the time. A lot of these coaches won multiple national championships. You have your athletic department's named after them. Some of the fields are named after them. You have Bear Bryant, Woody Hayes, Bo Schembechler, Bob Devaney at Nebraska, Tom Osborne, Darrell Royal at Texas. You had, we'll go through the rest of them, but these coaches before, during, and after this 20-year period won a share of 40 national championships during this time. Pretty remarkable. So, and you had the limited major bowls. You had 4 major bowls and 5 minor bowls. So at the end of the year, you were playing one of these teams. You lost, it gave somebody else a national championship, and we'll get into that. You had John McKay at USC and John Robinson, Joe Paterno at Penn State, Bud Wilkinson at Oklahoma, and Barry Switzer at Oklahoma. Complete legends. Just to give you an idea, Woody Hayes won 2 national championships at Ohio State prior to 1960, and then he won 3 while he was there. Wilkinson won 3 at OU in the 50s. You had Tom Osborne won 3 national championships in the 90s. Lou Holtz won the 88 national championship at Notre Dame. He was coaching at Arkansas in the late 70s. Barry Switzer won the 85 national championship at OU afterwards. Joe Paterno finally won national championships in 82 and 86. He was a little ticked off that he went undefeated a number of times and never could win, and we'll go into that. And Bo, here we go. We got Arbus Parsegian. We have Dan Devine, Frank Broyles, and Lou Holtz. Era won 3 national championships. Dan Devine won 1. Frank Broyles won 1 in 64. And Lou Holtz, like I'd mentioned, he was a coach at Arkansas in the late 70s, won 1 at Notre Dame in 88. Bo Schembechler, the only coach on that list not to win a national championship during that time frame or afterwards.
Yes, and I'll make a quick note for Earl Bruce, who snuck in right at the tail end of this 20 years for Ohio State. He did have a nice 1979 season that was spoiled by a great USC team with Paul McDonald and Anthony Munoz and Ronnie Lott and that crew that took away the national championship 17-16 in the Rose Bowl from Ohio State. But I digress. Here is the core of really getting underneath the numbers now, Rick.
Yeah, so we'll get into this. Here's the elite versus the elite. Again, these are the top 10 programs that I outlined in the beginning, and these are the times they played these different teams during the season, whether it's a rivalry game, they were in the same league, or it was a bowl game. That's how you played each other, or it was a scheduled out-of-conference game. So keep in mind, for reference, this is not these teams, how they fared against top teams at the time, top 10 teams at the time. These are the games that they played against these teams that were the top 10 teams winning percentage of the 2 decades. Elite of elite. So Oklahoma played 55 games. Basically 1 out of every 4 games they're playing against elite program. And that's because they were in the same conference in the Big 8 with Nebraska, and they had the annual rivalry with Texas out of the Southwest. Texas, 23% of their games basically, because they had Arkansas in the Southwest and they had the game with Oklahoma. If you look at USC, they had their annual rivalry with Notre Dame. Fast forwarding here through Nebraska. You had Ohio State, I think it was right before USC, and they had their annual rivalry with Michigan, as you see. Notre Dame, vice versa, played USC. Nebraska played OU in the Big 8 every year. Alabama didn't have a rival. Now, granted, they played teams in the SEC, but as you see, Alabama was the only team in the SEC that was in the top 10 winning percentage teams of the 60s and 70s. And so basically, less than 1 out of every 10 games was a big game for Alabama. Now, they played these top teams typically in bowl games. And there was limited opportunity for them to schedule out-of-conference games, and we'll go into that. A lot of it was Perhaps they wanted to stay in the South. Teams didn't want to travel to the South. There was issues going on at the time with civil rights, desegregation. That was big during the 60s. So if you looked at Penn State was an independent, they really didn't have any rivals that were in the top 10. They played Pitt, West Virginia, Maryland, basically every year in Syracuse. But again, those teams weren't top-ranked teams. So they were kind of limited to playing a team in a bowl game, kind of like a Boise State, if you will. Now, how do these teams fare when they played up against each other? What were their winning percentages and what were their records? USC fared the best, 26-16-4 at 609, followed by Texas, Notre Dame. Alabama was 11-9-2. They had a 545 winning percentage, but again, small sample size, 22 games. Oklahoma, if you remember, they played the most games. And so there's risk reward because they were playing, Texas and Nebraska every year. They went 20-26-3, very, very strong strength of schedule. Oklahoma 500%, and Nebraska 426. Penn State, again, 11 games. It's the lack of their competition, kind of like a Boise State. Don't tell Joe Paterno that, though. He'd be very upset. 364. Michigan 8-15-1, and Arkansas was 9-18. Thoughts, Mark, when you're looking at the info?
Yeah, just obviously at that point in time, Penn State just played a much different schedule. They would later, of course, join the Big Ten in 1993. And even during the last 10 to 12 years of Joe Paterno's run prior to the Big Ten, they played a much tougher schedule. But back in the 60s and early 70s, yeah, there was a definite distinction between Penn State's schedule and everyone else.
Yeah. So how did they do in major bowls? Back then, the major bowls, very similar to now. There's 4 of them. It's the orange, the rose, the sugar, and the cotton. Alabama didn't have any bowl restrictions placed upon them in the SEC because the SEC didn't have a conference commissioner. They allowed their schools to make their own schedules, the number of games they wanted to play, locations. They did institute a minimum number of games to qualify for the SEC championship in the 70s. But pretty much Bear Bryant was the SEC. They had 15 major bowl games. They had a 9-6 record. USC played primarily in the Rose. They had a no repeat rule for some time in the Pac-10, as well as they weren't allowed to go to other bowls until 75, like the Big Ten. And Notre Dame, like I said, had the no bowl policy until 1969. But as you can see, when they started going to bowls after that, 5-2, they had some major wins in 73 and 74 against Alabama in the Sugar Bowl, and then a rematch in Miami in the Orange Bowl, beating Bear Bryant 2 times in a row. Penn State was 5-3, Arkansas 4-6, Ohio State 3-6, and Michigan 1-6. And that's primarily to facing a USC team most of the time in the Rose Bowl.
We can let these graphics roll through because I've got a number of points to hit, and I'm sure the chat does as well. So again, folks, comments and questions, anything concerning this topic of 1960 through 79 in regards to best programs in college football.
Okay, then we have national championships. And back then, like I'd mentioned, they were shared. And we'll get into more detail. We'll let the graphics go through, but I'll go in and we'll have more discussion. But Alabama had 6, USC 5, Notre Dame 4, Ohio State 3, Texas 3. And that was going to be followed by, as you'll see, just going through this, Alabama had 5 shared national championships. The only one they didn't share was 1979. And even that could be controversial, and we can talk about that. USC had 5. 3 were sole championships. 2 were shared. Notre Dame had 4 national championships, of which one was not shared. We move on to Nebraska 2, Oklahoma 2, Arkansas 1, Michigan State 0, and Penn State 0. Nebraska had a shared championship in 70, won one in 71. Oklahoma had 2 in 74 and 75. They were penalized in 73. Could have had another one, but they were on probation. And Arkansas won one in 64 that was shared with 2 other teams. That was with, I believe, Notre Dame and Alabama.
All right, Rick, you want me to cut loose on this?
Cut loose.
All right, a few things come to mind.
Yep.
First of all, going back to, and I enjoyed your breakdown of the game, the changes to the game, because certainly you can go through any era and as I play producer and graphics guy at the same time as host, but and list the changes to the game that were paramount to the evolution of the game. So you ran down a number there. It still is just mind-boggling to me that, number one, that the Big Ten had a no-repeat rule in the Rose Bowl. So there were times in which an undefeated, near-ranked number 1, 2, 3 in the country team, Ohio State many times because they were the dominant team in the league, just like they have been recently, most of the time, didn't get a shot to go play in the Rose Bowl for a national championship the next season, or to, cap off an undefeated season the next year. Also, the other rule in the Big Ten was that no one else could go to a bowl game until 1975. The second place team in the Big Ten did not go to a bowl game, and there was a sequence of years in the 70s, 72, 3, 4, and 5, where Ohio State went 3-0-1 against Michigan. They tied once, and Ohio State was voted to go to the Rose Bowl that year. Ohio State went to 4 consecutive Rose Bowls. They beat Michigan all 3 years. Those are the only games Michigan lost, and they didn't go to a bowl game. They had to stay at home. They lost to Ohio State, or they tied, and they didn't go to a bowl game because no other teams from the Big Ten went to a bowl game. And the other point that you bring up about, and it's very true, that there was this exhibition approach to bowl games, at least by some. And I started watching college football in the late 70s. And by the time I started watching, it swung so heavily from one end of the spectrum to the other. By the time I started watching, these bowl games were like championship games. Like, they were huge. People loved them. People treated them as just everything. So I think the television exposure and seeing the great programs play each other on New Year's Day only took not even 10 years to change the thought process of everyone involved, from exhibition game to, no, this is a spectacle. This is important.
Absolutely, Mark. And for those of you that are of Mark and my age, or maybe slightly older or younger, you remember those New Year's Day games, those bowl games. It's scarcity drives demand. And right now we have oversaturation in the marketplace. And what happens in business when oversaturation in the marketplace? You cut brands. And that's sadly what's happening, and what the great debate was last night. It's like you had the Titanic was sinking, and you had one side, the Big 12, the other side, the Pac-12, and they're both tuning up their instruments, hoping they don't have to jump ship first. But that's how college football is now. But back then, the Rose Bowl had more viewers and was bigger than the Super Bowl. The Super Bowl was maybe 5 or 6 years old. The Rose Bowl was legendary. And to give you an idea, Mark, you touched upon the craziness of the Big Ten and the Pac-12. They had these no repeat Rose Bowl rules, and then they couldn't go to another bowl until 1975. And let's talk about 1973, because that was crazy for a number of different reasons. Okay. You had the UPI poll still naming their national championship after the regular season, before the bowl game. AP switched that A lot of it was based on 64. So let me briefly talk about 64 to get to 73. And we'll talk about, because in the Big Ten, Michigan and Ohio State had a little brouhaha, and Bo Schembechler was pissed. But back in 64, both Alabama and Alabama and Arkansas finished the year undefeated. And in that year, Arkansas, one of their rivals in the Southwest Conference, was Texas. And at the time, this was, I think, sometime in October, Arkansas goes on the road in Austin and beats number one Texas at the time, 14-13. And at the end of the year, they were not number one. Alabama was number one. Then they played the bowl game. And Arkansas played, I believe, Nebraska, and they beat them 10-7. And in the Cotton Bowl, Texas played Alabama, and Texas beat Alabama. So there you see, there was the controversy. It was a bowl game. Why didn't it matter? Well, the voting entities had their rules at the time. So obviously that national championship was split, and that caused a precedent. And we moved to 73. Now, 73, at the end of the regular season, there were 6 teams, major teams, that were unbeaten. And you had, in 73, bear with me, got my notes here. There's a lot to keep in mind here. You had Alabama. You had help me out here, Mark.
I got you here. I'm pulling this up right now. If I can move the screen all the way down. So going into bowl play, we had Alabama number 1, 11-0. This is the AP poll.
Okay.
Oklahoma 10-0-1. Number 2, number 3 was Notre Dame at 10-0. Ohio State 9-0-1 at number 4. Michigan 10-0-1 at 5. Penn State 11-0 at 6. Those are the either undefeated or no loss teams.
You also had number 15 Miami of Ohio, which was a major team, but still they were unbeaten, and they went on to beat Florida State in the Tangerine Bowl. But getting back to 73, Oklahoma couldn't participate in the bowl game because they were on probation. You had Michigan and Ohio State. They played each other. And correct me if I'm wrong, Mark, but this was the game that ended in a tie.
Yes.
So
10-10.
Here's where these rules are crazy. Okay. So they didn't have the no repeat rule anymore because that was lifted in 71. So you had 2 teams, Alabama and you had Ohio State and Michigan, and the ADs had a vote who was going to go to the Rose Bowl. And Michigan's quarterback broke his collarbone in that game. Dennis Franklin, I believe is his name.
Yes.
And so the ADs voted Ohio State to go to the Rose Bowl, which infuriated Michigan and Bo Schembechler. Because remember, they had a rule at the time that you couldn't go to another bowl. So basically Michigan didn't lose, but they couldn't go to a bowl. They couldn't go to the Rose Bowl. So I don't know if this for a fact, maybe you would, Mark, but I think that was probably one of the main factors why they lifted the no secondary bowl rule, which took effect in 75. And I imagine because the Pac-10 and the Big Ten did a lot of things together, that the Big Ten instituted that rule allowing other teams to go to bowl games. And I think maybe that's why the Pac-10 did it as well. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I know that was an impetus for it, but also somebody in the league office woke up and determined if we have a second place team that is typically Ohio State or Michigan go play in. So the first second place team to play in a bowl game was a top 5 Michigan team in 1975. They went and played in the Orange Bowl and played Oklahoma on NBC. That's great exposure for the conference. It's money. It's prestige. Why would you not do that? So absolutely.
So we get to the end of the season, and then bowl selections happened. And you had Alabama that had a dry run there. They hadn't been number one since the end of the 65 season. So they go through almost 8 years. They beat Auburn towards the end of the 73 season to become number one. So they hadn't been number one from 65 to 73. And a lot happened at that time, Mark. A lot of people have different stories, depending on which team you follow, which stories you believe. But everybody can agree on one thing. There was the civil rights movement that was happening in the South. Federal legislation passed in 64. There was the Jim Crow laws earlier in the 50s. Obviously, the SEC and Alabama were at the epicenter of it. And, Bear Bryant had more power than George Wallace. And some will debate that. But, Alabama didn't have the same type of teams that they had in the early 60s. Whether or not that was because they weren't, integrating African-American players. Maybe that was an issue still within the private and public universities in the South. That's debatable. But what's not debatable is that they didn't have some of these great players. And Duffy Daugherty had the Underground Railroad, and he had some great teams winning national championships in the mid-60s. And we just finished the NFL draft, and look at Georgia. They had 25 players in the last 2 years in the NFL draft. You look at that 67 NFL draft, and Michigan State had 4 players drafted in the top 8. Bubba Smith, number 1. And he was from Texas. Now, whether he went to Michigan State because he didn't have opportunities to play in the South, there's a lot of great African-American players that played in the South. I mean, that played in the North, or they didn't go to SEC schools in the South. So, there was a 11th game that was added at the beginning of the 70 season, and John McKay and Bear Bryant were friends. And Bear Bryant asked John McKay to bring his team in 1970 to play. Now, there was integration already going on in some parts of the South, but what cannot be debated is it took a little bit longer than maybe it should have, but for whatever reason, there was a game that was played in 69 that didn't have as much exposure, but Florida A&M, an all-black school, played the University of Tampa in front of 45,000 people in 1969. Didn't get a lot of publicity. But when you have USC and John McKay that had won 2 national championships in the 60s with stars such as, O.J. Simpson, Heisman Trophy winner Mike Garrett, and, on the 70 team, you had Sam Van Cunningham, and you had a black quarterback as well. They go down there and they put a number on Alabama, 42-21. Whether or not that changed the thinking down there, we don't know. It's debatable. But the game did happen. And like you talk about, Mark, facts, it was 42-21. Thoughts?
Well, I have thoughts about national championships all over the place. So I will get to those at another point, and because I have gone through in the past every season over the last close to 100 years and reworked the national championships, and almost every one is flawed before 1998. So that's an exercise for another day, because I'm going to start that series. I've got notes all over the place. I just have to start that series up to go through each and every season. 1978 is notable, of course, when you have 2 teams, in my eyes, that both played top-notch schedules, top-notch conferences, and had the same record, and one of them defeated the other. Then you have a clear national champion, and that's USC in 1978 over Alabama. And there are all sorts of situations like that should be rectified in my eyes.
So speaking of national championships, so this game in 73, Alabama was number 1 at the end of the regular season. And so UPI named them the national champion. And this was the first time, as I mentioned, Alabama had been number 1 since 1965. And since 65, Alabama had lost 5 major bowls and 2 minor bowls. So they've gone 7 years without winning a bowl game. Whether or not that's because they didn't have the talent compared to the rest of the teams that around the country, that could be a reason. Don't know. But take a look at it, and the other teams that were winning national championships maybe didn't have the same issues that Alabama was facing. Don't know. But 1973, Bear Bryant called out Eric Persegian and wanted to face Notre Dame. And Notre Dame had the chance to either go to the Orange Bowl for a more lucrative deal or to go play Alabama, knowing that not many people beat Bear Bryant down in the Sugar Bowl down in Alabama. Prior to that, Alabama was 3-0 in the Sugar Bowl. So try going down there and beating Bear Bryant in the Bayou. Not on everybody's list, but Notre Dame, being the school that they are, the champions they are, Eric Persegian said, yes, we're going to go play Notre Dame. And Notre Dame was number 3. They were national champions already, Alabama. This game was huge. It was on ABC, and you had Chris Schenkel and Howard Cosell on the call. This game got a 25.4 Nielsen rating on New Year's Eve. All the bowl games were being played the next day. Everybody in 1973 was watching this game. And if you recall, Mark, back in the day, Chris Schenkel and Howard Cosell called a lot of boxing matches. You had, kind of like college football, you had all these different governing bodies, the WBF, the IBF, the WBC, right? You had the SEC, you had the Pac-8, you had the Big Ten, you had the ACC, right? You had all these different conferences. And there were teams in college football avoiding one another, just like these boxers avoided one another. Believe it or not, Mark, this game in the Sugar Bowl was the first time Notre Dame and Alabama ever played one another. Both schools had played more than 500 games each in their beautiful, glorious collective history, but yet did not ever play one another.
Yeah, it's quite an era of college football in the 60s and 70s. Does anyone have any comments or questions concerning what we're dissecting here? Have you looked at, or I should say, once you have looked at all the factors involved, Rick, have you come up with a list of how you would rank these 10 schools, 1 through 10, with everything factored in?
That's a great question. I didn't rank them. I didn't, but I came up with 2, possibly 3 schools that I would rank ahead of Alabama. That's what I looked at. I didn't re-rank them. But there's other factors that I haven't discussed yet that would give you a little bit more background of why I chose those 3 schools. But if you look at the Sugar Bowl in 73, incredible game. Notre Dame won the game 24-23. And they were backed up on their 2-yard line with less than 3 minutes to go, facing a 3rd and 8, knowing that if they punted the ball, Alabama could get a back kick, a field goal, and win. And when you're faced against Bear Bryant in the Bayou, Eric Persegian was a gambler. And he called a play, power I, right tackle trap, pass left. They had a tight end, All-American tight end, Pete Demerly. They pulled out for the play, and they put in a backup. I believe his name was Robin Weber, who had only caught 1 pass in his whole career. And he was the tight end on that play. And they threw it to him. He caught it for a 1st down. They got another 1st down, and they ran out the clock. But that's how you win. You win to play. You play the game to win, right? Win to play the game. And so that was a legendary game because, it, like I said, it got a 25.4 Nielsen rating. It basically announced college football is just an amazing sport. To give you an idea, the 2011 BCS National Championship got an 11.0 Nielsen rating. So again, scarcity drives demand. Two teams that have never played before. Bear Bryant is back trying to win the Sugar Bowl after a 8-year absence in the Bayou, and he loses to the era of Ara Parsegian. And then they get rematched the next year in the Orange Bowl, and Ara does it to him again. He beats Bear Bryant, and he walks off. Ara dropped the mic. He retired. 2-0 versus the Bear. And guess what? No, Alabama in 1975 played at Notre Dame. It was against Dan Devine, but they played at Notre Dame. They left the South, and they went north of the Mason-Dixon line, and they lost again. Notre Dame was 3-0 versus Bear Bryant from 60 to 79. And for good measure, Notre Dame returned the favor, went down to Alabama in 1980 and beat them 7-0. So at that point, Notre Dame 3-0 during that particular time period, but in 1980 they also went down there and beat them again.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a fascinating topic, and to just go by the winning percentages, although I certainly give the winning percentages much more weight than national championships, because the national championships, almost every one is flawed in some way. Not that the team that was determined to be the national champion is not deserving of it, but that there are typically other teams that you just don't have enough cross competition. You just don't have enough game results against each other to typically pick out a national champion. There is typically not a clear-cut national champion any of these seasons because teams didn't play each other.
Right. And so here's an example of another flawed national championship, in my opinion. 1978. Alabama won the AP championship and USC won the UPI championship. And here you have a head-to-head matchup. So USC went down there in 1970, maybe helped integrate the South. Who knows? But everybody saw that game. They saw it, 42-21. And Bear Bryant came back to LA the next year and beat USC. And he also beat him in 77. But USC went down back to Birmingham in 78. And Alabama was number one at the time. And guess what? Bear Bryant, nobody's ever beaten a number one team up to that point. A number one Alabama team in the South. In Alabama. Parsegian did it in New Orleans, the Sugar Bowl. USC went down there and beat Alabama 24-14. The game was really 24-7. Tony Nathan scored a late touchdown. But there you have a head-to-head win, not in LA, but in Birmingham. And then USC loses a game at Arizona State. And the other difference is that USC played Hawaii that year, so that was an extra game. They were 12-1, and Alabama was 11-1. And USC played 6 road games, actually 5 road games. They played UCLA at the Coliseum. And Alabama played 3. And USC played against a better strength of schedule. And they had to split the national championship. So that's a flawed one.
It is a flawed one. It's similar to 1993 when Notre Dame should have a national championship over Florida State. They beat them head-to-head. Similar situation. So Michael Wall jumping on here with a comment. Michael says, I know my alma mater will get no love or respect, but the University of Houston had only 4 losing seasons from 1960 through 79. The Cougars did not join the Southwest Conference till the mid-70s, but we have more history than people realize. Yeah, absolutely. When I started watching college football, Houston was a contender for the Cotton Bowl many times, played, I believe, in the first 2 Cotton Bowls I ever watched, the famous Joe Montana 1979 game, 1978 season, 1979 New Year's Day, when he had hypothermia and came off the bench and led a huge comeback against Houston. And then Houston came back the next year and played Nebraska in the Cotton Bowl. So yeah, Houston was a major factor in the Southwest Conference, and the last time they really showed themselves was against Doug Flutie. They played Flutie in '84 in the Cotton Bowl as the Southwest Conference champions, but of course that league was only about 10 years away from dissolving, and now Houston's got another chance here with its entry into the Big 12 to play with the big boys and see if they can regain some of their past glory. But thank you for that, Michael.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. Yeah, the Houston was regularly on Alabama's schedule from 60 to 71. They played them 6 times. Alabama beat them all 6 times. But Houston developed as a program. As Michael mentioned, they joined the Southwest Conference. That was in 76. But playing against those teams in Alabama, they had a look at what excellence was. And that's a great point. Only 4 losing seasons during that era. But again, they were, not playing the best competition every week until, later in the 70s. You take a look back at 78, Mark, and you use the metrics that people talk about today. Well, how many ranked teams did you beat? And strength of schedule. Alabama that year, they beat number 8 Nebraska, number 15 Missouri, and number 1 Penn State in the bowl game. USC beat, like I said, Alabama in Birmingham, number 1. They beat number 7 Notre Dame. They beat number 12 Michigan State. They beat number 14 UCLA, and they beat number 17 Stanford. Both teams, Alabama and USC, had a common opponent, which was the University of Washington. Now, USC played Washington at home, and they beat them 28-10. Believe it or not, Alabama traveled all the way to Seattle to play Washington, Don James Washington Huskies, and they beat them 20-17. So you take a look at that, pretty amazing.
What was the score of the USC Arizona State game?
Arizona State beat them 20-7. So that's the one loss they had. That was a Frank Kush team. They were 9-3. So this wasn't like a 2-8 Arizona State team. Now, a lot of people are asking, hey, how is USC going to do in the Big Ten with all this traveling? Okay, that's another factor. Take a look at 78. USC played 6 games, 5. They played at Bama. They played at Oregon, at ASU, at Stanford, and at Hawaii. Do the math on that. It's 11,400 round trip miles in 1979. So if they can make those road trips then, USC can do it now. It's like when you're built for a championship, that's part and parcel. In comparison, Alabama, they didn't have to travel as far because the schools are a lot closer. Like I said, they played 3 road games at Mizzou, at UW, and at Tennessee. Total round trip miles, 5,500.
Shule Sooner says here, Bama also beat the number 1 ranked team in the country, Penn State, as you noted, Rick, that year too. It's debatable. So that's that's a point that a lot of people make. So I am all in on head to head. If everything else is equal, then I just figure this is why we play the games. Yes, they played the game and one team won the game. And in this case, as Rick pointed out, it wasn't a close game. It wasn't a blowout, but it was not close. It was not a fourth quarter game. USC controlled the game. They owned the game 24/7. Last 4 or 5 minute touchdown by Bama, 24-14. USC was clearly the better team on the road. But I do see this come up from time to time, that if you look at strictly, and as you laid out the, and I've gone through this season before. I don't know that I posted a video on this season, but I've gone through the season because I'm going to go through the entire history of the sport and go through each season and rewrite these national championships that are screwed up. But a lot of people take up the debate that who had the better loss. And as you sized up the two schedules, I don't think there's anything discernible there. They both played roughly the same number of ranked teams. And I remember, again, going through it, and I didn't find anything that I thought was discernible in regards to, it's not a situation like with a Boise State trying to compare them against somebody who from a Power Five who played such a much tougher schedule. They both played difficult schedules against a lot of ranked teams. But yes, Bama had the better loss. They lost to the better team. There's no question about that. But yeah, that team should have been voted the national champion.
Again, USC. It's like, who had the better loss? Obviously, Alabama lost to number one Penn State. But as we pointed out earlier, Penn State wasn't playing great competition. So that number one ranking, okay. Well, who did they beat? USC beat 5 ranked teams, and Alabama beat 3. But at the time, did people really consider that? I don't know. And that's why you had a split national championship, I believe, is because the UPI, the coaches, know how difficult it is to go into Alabama and beat Bear Bryant, much less a number one team. And just for little facts, because that's what we like to share here, Mark, on the Voice of College Football. Do you know the next year or the next time that Alabama was number one and lost in the state of Alabama?
Hang on just a second. The next time that they were number one and lost in the state, I'm going to say, I guarantee that if I went year by year, I could nail it, but we're not going to sit here for 45 minutes. So I'm going to say the 2013 Auburn Iron Bowl game.
Close. 2012. They lost at home, A&M.
Against Johnny Manziel and company.
So 34 years. That just doesn't happen all the time. And if you go hit rewind 8 years later or 8 years earlier, USC went into Alabama and beat them. So in the 20 years that we're looking at, to show you how monumental those wins are, Alabama, okay, and this is uneven, balanced schedule. They played a lot of home games, a lot of neutral games. Obviously they played Auburn every year in Birmingham. It was a neutral game. Alabama only lost 11 times, and they tied 2 games. They were 16-4 against Auburn. They had 2 losses against Tennessee. They were 14-5-1 against Tennessee. Their 2 main rivals. Okay, they were 14-2 against LSU. They lost against LSU 1 time in Birmingham, and they lost 1 time against Florida in the early 60s. They lost to USC 2 times, and they lost to Mizzou. There was only 3 out-of-conference teams that went in and beat Bear Bryant in Birmingham. That was Mizzou and USC did it twice. USC had more wins against Alabama than LSU and Florida, and they tied Tennessee. 2 for 2, batting 1,000. That's kind of hard to do. And you take a look at Notre Dame going 3-0 during that period. So you can take a look at the inequalities with the voting polls when they voted for national championships. As you pointed out, they're all flawed. But it's kind of like, okay, what are your records against the best teams?
Yeah, so to clarify a few points here, looking at Penn State. So Penn State won in Columbus against a good Ohio State team. So we're talking about, again, 1978. That was not a great Ohio State team, so I want to be clear about that. It was a good team. They did not win the Big Ten championship. They went to the Gator Bowl that year. They were ranked 6th at the time, but they finished 7-3-1 in the regular season. So anyway, that was one of Penn State's better wins. Going to Columbus, they beat Ohio State. They beat a Maryland team that was number 5 at the time that finished. I don't have a final record on Maryland, but they were 5th in the country with about 3 weeks to go. So they must have had a nice season. And then they beat Pitt, who finished 8-4 and was number 15 in the country. And then, if anyone recalls, that wants to take the pro USC side in 1978, Penn State might have scored a touchdown against Alabama at the goal line late in that game. It was a 14-7 Alabama win. And if you watch the instant replay, Bama made a valiant, great defensive stand at the goal line. However, it's debatable on one of those Penn State plunges as to whether they broke the plane or touched the plane of the goal line that would have created a tie ball game. Go back and watch it. All right, we got a couple callers here, Rick, if you want to take them on.
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, our buddy Christopher's joining us. Chris, welcome to the Voice of College Football. Good to see you.
Hey, Mark. How are you?
I am doing just fine.
Did you mention in the Rose Bowl, I don't know exactly what, you probably have a better recollection of it than I do, but didn't Michigan, they had like either a fumble that wasn't called, or I don't know if you remember.
Yeah, 1978, right, Rick?
Yes, there was a Charles White leapt into the end zone and clearly fumbled the ball probably between the 2 and 3 yard line. They didn't have review back then, so that was the phantom touchdown. And maybe that swayed voters that, look, USC won 17-10, but that game could have been a tie, right? And then you had Alabama beating Penn State. So that's a great point, Chris. And that was
a great point.
That was part of
I blanked on that one. I haven't thought about that play for a long time. Yep. But that is a great point. And USC won 17-10, correct?
Yes.
That was the final. Yep. Interesting. It's interesting that USC won on a controversial play, and who knows what would have happened. You can never predict the trajectory of a game after something like that happened, but Bama had the same fortune at the goal line against Penn State. So they both won their bowl games very close in defensive struggles. Good point, Chris.
There was one other thing I was going to ask. Let me think. I'm kind of drawing a blank. I'm sorry, Mark. Do you, in your justification for titles, and I'm not trying to take away anything from your way of going about it, I guess, but so you put a lot of stock, I guess, into the head-to-head competition, but how do you, like, for example, if it's between USC and Alabama with USC winning the tiebreaker, but how do you address the fact that USC lost to Arizona State? Do you just kind of, I don't know how you can really use it in one case and then maybe kind of ignore it in the other? I don't know if that's what you're doing, but does that make sense to you?
So here's how I basically review these seasons: is I just look at the record first and foremost, line up the teams that either, if there is a slew of undefeated teams or one-loss teams, and then I look for head-to-head games, and I also look at the schedules, and if there is a clear distinction in schedules, which, of course, once we get into the BCS era and we have the emergence of Boise State and TCU, the only times I will consider them worthy of consideration for a national championship is if they have a much better record than the teams we're talking about, or a decided better record, meaning they completed the season undefeated. I'm not going to consider a TCU or Boise State, let's say in the BCS era, with the level of play that they participated against on their schedule, with the same record as the likes of USC, Ohio State, whomever was vying for a national championship that season. But for the case that we're bringing up in 1978, yeah, that is my clear distinction, is that we had two teams. So this was fairly rare at the time. We had the two teams that were under consideration for the national championship. And I'd have to go back to look at the rankings to see if anybody else should be considered. I don't believe so. It's those two teams, and they had the same record. And to Rick's point, USC played an extra game and was 12-1, and USC won the game on the road by 2 scores.
Sure. No, I'm not trying to like make a point that you're wrong or anything. I was just trying to get down to where I understood exactly what your point was. But I don't know that I necessarily disagree. I think that's probably as good a way to settle it as any. But there was one thing, and I don't want to waste your time, Mark, because I know you have other people on the line. But
you're not wasting our time, Chris. Go ahead.
I kind of feel like I am. But anyway, in 1996, I know people think I have BYU on the brain. I really don't. But my question would be, the reason I get upset though a little bit is, it's okay to dismiss a loss by USC against a WAC opponent, but if BYU loses to Washington in a similar, I guess, kind of a similar situation, well, we can just throw, they don't even have a chance to win a title. I don't know if I quite understand the logic behind that, but
you're bringing up the 14-1 BYU team, correct?
Yeah, 96.
Yeah, and you're debating that they should claim a national championship?
Well, not exactly. I don't understand how we can, in one case, say it's allowed, maybe. I mean, Arizona State, they were a WAC, not at the time, I don't think, but they were a WAC team. And so if BYU loses to Arizona State, they're automatically, thrown under the bus, I guess. But if they actually lost to Washington, is who they lost to. But I mean, it's kind of, to me, it's the same thing. It's like they're both 9-3. How in one case can you say one's still in the hunt and the other one's completely gone?
So my evaluation of 1996 is probably not a popular one. Florida, again, so at one point, as Rick explained, these bowl games were almost considered to be exhibitions. And then we got to a point in the 70s where me as a fan, I thought they were everything. They were phenomenal. They were the pinnacle of college football. But I think looking back in history, because we're so focused on trying to determine who won the national champion, who was the one team, that we now treat them like they're playoff games. Well, I don't consider them playoff games either. They're just an additional game against a really good opponent. So I wouldn't. So, for example, in 1996, Florida State beat Florida, the final game of the regular season. They rematched in the Sugar Bowl. Florida won the rematch. Meanwhile, Ohio State won the Rose Bowl. All three teams finished 11-1. Who wins the national championship? Well, Florida did because they were awarded by the voters because they got a rematch with Florida State. However, if you look at the totality of the season, you've got three teams in three really strong conferences with really strong schedules that all beat 4, 5, 6 ranked teams, really good teams. They all lost one game, and Florida State split. So in my eyes, you've got a split national championship between those three. That's what I think is justified.
Yeah, and I don't know that I disagree with you on that. I think, but again, like just looking back, and this is kind of what I do when there's a problem like that. I kind of, if one had played, like you said, USC played an additional game, so I kind of look at it as like advantage USC in that 12-1 over 11-1 sort of thing. I don't know if that's necessarily applies in every circumstance, but that's one reason I might like. If it were up to me, maybe I might. I mean, I don't. Maybe I don't put as much stock in the head-to-head as you do, but all things being equal, I think I tend to agree with you that it would probably, for my opinion, I would probably lean towards USC, even though I know I don't make those decisions. I'm just saying, if it were up to me, that's probably what I would look at, though, is the fact one was 12-1, one was 11-1.
And in the case of 1996, BYU had a remarkable season, but I'm looking at their schedule, and it's the schedule that I remember looking at.
Yeah.
They beat Kansas State and Wyoming. Those were their two best wins.
Well, Texas A&M.
Texas A&M. What did Texas A&M finish that year?
I don't remember.
They went 6-6.
Okay, well that's fair. I'm not like trying to like put a, actually kind of what I ended up doing. There's one other thing, and I don't know if they're probably being joking. Mike in the chat said, well, are we going to, and this is what I discovered, Mike, and this is recently, and so you can throw it out the window if you want. What I discovered was if BYU in 1984 was 13-0 without any like question, then they finished first, but if they're not, then they don't. I don't know if that helps.
Run that by me again. They went 13-0, yes.
Well, no, they had a problem against Pittsburgh. I don't think they really beat Pittsburgh. People keep saying, well, they beat Pittsburgh, but really they didn't. I mean, it looked like Pittsburgh got cheated out of a touchdown, and I don't like to win games where you're like there's disputed to it.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that, and I remember watching the game, but it was 39 years ago, so I don't recall the play or anything. That game was actually on ESPN. I think it was one of their first televised live television games. Anyway, I'd like to go back and see it. I wonder if it's on YouTube. So you have battled all this time, Chris, on behalf of BYU, and now you're telling me that they won a game that they shouldn't have won.
Well, I don't know that I don't really take a side. That's what people think is they think I take a side. I really don't.
Okay.
Actually, what I discovered recently in this, if they didn't beat Pittsburgh, which I'm saying, I actually kind of saying they didn't beat Pittsburgh, then the championship should have been Washington. I mean, I'm actually saying that's who it should have been.
Okay.
If they didn't beat Pittsburgh, and if they tied Pittsburgh, which is what I'm kind of saying they did, then they actually share a title with Iowa because, and I don't know if you want to get into that or not, but
Not really.
well, it's kind of important though. I mean, if it's history,
What are we trying to get into?
if BYU was 12-0-1, which is what
Yes.
I'm actually saying they are, then they share a title with Iowa.
But they won that game by 6, correct, against Pitt?
Yeah.
Well,
but
would Pitt have won the game with the touchdown?
No, would have tied it, but I'm not giving Pitt an extra point they didn't try. I don't think that's really fair to do that, is it?
Well, it's not fair. Well, none of it's fair because we almost have to assume when teams make 95% of their PATs that they would be able to convert a PAT, but we're not going to get that far into the weeds. Make your point, Chris.
Well, no, I'm giving credit where I feel like it belongs. So I'm saying they tied Pittsburgh and Pittsburgh tied Navy. And that actually does kind of matter. You might not think it does, but when they tied Navy, what I consider ties to be kind of transitive. So that means that Pittsburgh and Navy were probably about the same talent. I don't know if you look at it the same way or not. That's the way I look at it. Kind of the same head-to-head argument that you're making. Anyway, Navy beat South Carolina, so I think it's at least possible that Pittsburgh might have beaten South Carolina. I'm not saying they would have.
You're traveling all over the country, creating matchups that are insignificant to the final result. You're bringing teams. The difference between what I do and what you do, Chris, is I stick to the teams that are contending for a national championship. You're traveling all over the country, grabbing teams that were like the 50th best team in the country.
No, you said head-to-head, and that's what I consider a head-to-head.
Yes, but you're grabbing teams that are insignificant to the championship race. They were not in the championship race.
Navy beat South Carolina, and South Carolina was cruising towards a title until they lost to Navy.
They were cruising toward what title?
The national title.
Okay. All right, Chris. And anything else you got for us?
Yeah, and then Navy lost to Air Force, and Air Force lost to BYU.
Yes. Go back to your belt championship. That's a fun thing.
That's head-to-head, Mark. Come on.
Yes, but you're taking the transit. You know what I did a couple years ago? That was very easy to do on the fly. I did this on the fly with someone that brought a debate like yours. Do you know who beat Ohio State 2 years ago? The Ohio State team that won the Rose Bowl and was one of the 4 best teams in the country?
No.
Northern Arizona beat them.
Okay.
By the transitive property.
Well, no, that's not. You had degrees.
Absolutely.
No. You're not taking in degrees of separation.
Ohio State lost to Oregon. Oregon lost to Stanford. Stanford lost to Arizona. Arizona lost to Northern Arizona. Northern Arizona beat Ohio State by your logic.
No, that's 4 degrees of separation.
Okay. All right, Chris. Thanks for the call.
All right. Thanks, Mark. Have a good day.
I didn't know that there was a rule on degrees of separation. Chris has devised a rule. 3's okay. 4's not allowed. All right. We'll get to our next caller. We got Christian on the line. Christian, what's going on? No, we got Will. I clicked on Christian.
You can take Christian first and come back to me.
Very good. The boxes switched on me there. Christian, how you doing tonight?
What's up, guys? Mark and I guess Mr. Rick. I haven't met you yet, but it's good to see you guys.
Hey, how you doing, Christian? Good to meet you.
I'm doing good. So I'm not here necessarily like to be this pumped up Alabama fan or anything, but I will consider the program. I don't know if I want to say it was the greatest of the 6. In the 60s, maybe it could be considered, but it was definitely dominant back with Paul Bear Bryant, of course, as we know. I mean, he won 6 national titles total. A team I look at that I go back to, and I guess we do kind of claim this as a national title, but 1965, they opened up the season to Georgia and lost. But then they ended up winning every other game except for a tie with Tennessee. And they ended up beating the number 3 team, Nebraska, in the Orange Bowl 39-28 on New Year's Day, 1966. Just kind of throwing that out there. I noticed the title of the stream tonight is the greatest program of the 60s and 70s. I think a little bit of decline in the 70s for Alabama, but I think Bear Bryant was definitely at his peak in the 60s. What do you think?
Well, I think, Bear Bryant from 60 to 65, had a top program. But you look afterwards, and there was a drought. I think I had outlined it from 65 until 73.
Mm-hmm.
He wasn't ranked number one. He finally Bama became ranked again number one when they beat Auburn in December of 1973. And they won the national championship with UPI before the bowl game. And up until that point, from 65 to 73, they had lost 7 bowl games in a row. I'm sorry, not 7, but they had tied one. They had lost 6 and tied one. They tied the Bluebonnet Bowl. But that's not something Bear Bryant would be proud of tying the Bluebonnet Bowl. But then they lost to Notre Dame. The first time they ever beat Notre Dame or played Notre Dame, they lost to them. And the next year, they lose to Notre Dame again in the Orange Bowl. So there's questions as to, once they started playing better competition, what happened to Alabama? And I kind of laid out at the beginning, they, other than Penn State, didn't play these top 10 teams. They played them the fewest times, 22 times, 1 out of every 10 games that they played, the 230 games that they played in the 1960s and 70s was against those top 10 teams. And a lot of them were in the bowl games, but USC stepped up and they did 2 different home and homes in the 70s, and they went 2-2. Credit Alabama for having the guts to go out to LA, and they beat USC in 2 close games. USC goes down to Alabama, beats them in 2 games. Credit Bear Bryant for going to play Notre Dame, north of the Mason-Dixon line. In 75, he lost, but he went out there. And Missouri was the only other out of major team to come in and beat Bear Bryant in Alabama. So, he the early 60s, he did well, but I think, if you take a look at the games that they played, the big games that they played, they lost a few. They also went to Lincoln, Nebraska, and lost to Nebraska in the mid-70s.
Yeah, they did. I mean, I know that, like I was saying, Alabama with Bear Bryant, I think hit its peak in the 60s more so than the 70s because it just got tougher. I understand recruiting back then wasn't like how it is now. So I don't know how it was in terms of getting players or just trying to build a team, assemble a roster for Bear Bryant. I don't understand. But all I know is they had like this stretch where they had won like 3 national championships within a 5-year span, starting back in like 1961. And I know they shared one of them with Arkansas for like the 1964 season. And they did go, if they were to claim that, and whether they share it with someone or not, they were back-to-back champions, winning in 1965 when they beat Nebraska. So, I mean, I'm not here necessarily to say that they were hands down the most dominant in the 60s, but I think that's where Bear Bryant was at his peak and got most of his championships. And you could definitely make a case. It would have to be argued, though.
Yeah. Well, and here I'll leave you with this. So getting back, there was questions about Penn State, number 1 in 78 there, Mark. And while Chris was on the line, I just double checked. Penn State started the season at number 3. And yes, you did mention they beat Ohio State, who was number 6 at the time, Mark, but Ohio State didn't finish in the top 20 that year. Like you said, they weren't a very good team. So Penn State, they only beat 1 ranked team, and that was North Carolina State, who finished at number 18. So until they played Alabama, because they didn't lose, they stayed at number 1 because they moved up to number 1 because they kept on winning. But, who did you beat? But that was the way they judged those teams during the day. It was a different era. But if we use the metrics that we do now, And we look back at it, we were like, what the heck was anybody thinking? But that was college football back then. But you mean to tell me a USC team that beats 5 ranked teams is not as good as a Penn State team who had won 1? And I laid out their history. You know, Penn State didn't play a lot of those top 10 teams for whatever reason, right? But that's just the way it was. And Alabama, same thing. 1 out of every 10 games that Alabama played in the 60s and 70s was against one of those top 10 programs of that 2-era span of time.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Mark, thanks for letting me on. And what was your name? It was great talking with you.
Oh, my name is Rick Anaya. I go by LBC Trojan. You can find me there on Twitter.
Okay. I'll definitely give you a follow. You seem like you got a lot of insight. Thank you, man.
Hey, good meeting you, Chris.
Awesome.
Sports Media. Good to see you. Have a good night.
Thanks, Mark.
All right, let's keep it rolling here at the Voice of College Football and get a Notre Dame perspective from our buddy Will.
Will indeed. I think you're on mute. There you
What's
go.
going on, guys?
How's it going?
Man, it's crazy, like looking at all these great USC Notre Dame teams, but I feel like the Irish got to have more national championships. For the Trojans nicked us a lot back in the day, especially in 70 and 64.
Yep. You know, it always came down, it seemed like Notre Dame, USC playing Ohio State, USC playing Michigan, Notre Dame playing Alabama. These were, like I said, heavyweight fights back in the 70s. You got Ken Norton, Muhammad Ali, Joe Frazier, Larry Holmes, right? You got George Foreman. It's just, it was crazy how those games went. And if you look at it, I hate to bring up a bad memory, Will N.D., but 1974, you guys.
Oh, it was a great. Let's just turn it off after the first half. Let's turn it off after the first half.
Hey, you guys got the consolation prize. You went and beat Bear Bryant in the Orange Bowl. But had you have kept that lead at USC, you had an outside shot of winning the national championship.
Mm-hmm.
That's what those games were about.
Yeah, for sure.
So, and I'll. What are your comments on or questions on what you heard?
Well, I'm just thinking. Do you guys think it would be fun to like go back in the day and like somehow recreate a college football playoff with like the Ohio State Rose Bowl winning teams, USC? I know Texas had a few good years in there. Penn State had a few good years in there. Or do you guys like it the way it is with just the bowl games and not really knowing who's the best?
That's a great question. You know what? And I was going to leave you guys with this. Mm-hmm. So there was controversy, as I outlined in 78, right? And so many think on this side of the country in SoCal that we shouldn't have had to split that national championship, but we did. And that made it 5 Alabama, 5 USC. And in 1979, Alabama won their 6th national championship. Any guesses who finished number 2?
Trojans.
There you go. We beat number 1 Ohio State in the Rose Bowl.
You guys had some big guys on the lines. You guys need that today. You guys need those guys today.
So if there was ever a +1 situation, that should have been it. Okay, it happened after the Nebraska-Michigan year in 97 where it created change. We saw change that created in the 64 season with Arkansas and Alabama and a national championship there with the AP reversing their voting procedures. We saw it in the 73 national championship with Notre Dame and Alabama having to split that and UPI reversing how they award the national championship after the bowl games starting in the 74-75 season. After 79, to end the 2 decades, USC and Alabama should have played +1 to see who ended the decade with the most national championships. And that's the way I look at it.
Yeah.
I'll throw this perspective in that since Ohio State lost that Rose Bowl by 1 point in basically what amounted to a road game, that you can throw them into a playoff as well, especially since USC tied a game. USC did tie. Who, Stanford that year?
Yeah, we tied Stanford. Yeah, 21-21.
I don't
Damn
think we want to
trees.
look up Stanford's record from that year. I'm guessing they were like 5-6.
I don't know their record from there. That's a good question.
5-5-1.
5-5-1. That might as well be 5-6, right?
I thought I was
Yeah.
close.
It would have been fun in '73 to see Notre Dame and Ohio State too more, because Ohio State blew all the other teams out of the water that year too.
But
Except
these are
Michigan. Yeah.
these are the different things that keep on happening these days, right? All the imperfections when you're dealing with 5 major conferences, kind of like boxing. They have their own interests. They have their own beliefs, their own rules, the way they do things. That's what makes college football ugly and beautiful all at the same time.
Yeah. Another fun rivalry in the 60s and 70s was Notre Dame and Texas. They only played 3 times, but Texas edged the Irish out in '69, winning the national championship. Then '70, the Irish got them back and would have won the national championship if it wasn't for those pesky Trojans. And then at the end of the '77-'78 season, the Irish ended up winning the national championship against, what was the running back's name? Earl Campbell, Texas. So yeah, I would like to see another fun home and home between the Irish and the Longhorns as well. But Rick, Mark, this is a lot of fun. I'm a sucker for this history stuff, so love this show. This was a fun show.
If you love the history, Will, I'm about to unleash my year by year. I've taken notes all the way back to '07. I'm going to just start ripping them off. They're going to come out like every 2 or 3 hours.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thanks so much, guys. This was a lot of fun.
Champions.
Thanks, Will. Appreciate
Thanks
you.
for being here, Will. Have a good night.
You guys too.
All right. Really good stuff. It was great, Rick, to have you on. And it is easy for us just to look at the national championships or just to look at the winning percentage, but then to see how did these programs fare against each other. And I always like to take the deep dive, so I appreciate you presenting the comparisons and the lists and the numbers, and also to put in context the major changes to the game during that 20-year time frame. And I can't declare a winner myself based on that. However, I believe if I delved a little bit deeper, I believe I would vote USC as the #1 program over those 20 years.
It would be hard to disagree with you on that. And everybody knows that I am a Trojan, but I'll add this to it. Everybody knows that Notre Dame holds the all-time record over USC. I think we were like 38, 50-5 against Notre Dame. During that 20-year period with McKay and Robinson, USC was 11-7-2 against Notre Dame. Then if you look at Notre Dame being 3-0 against Bear Bryant and, winning a share of that national championship down in New Orleans, and they have 4 national championships. It's those are the 3 teams that are debatable. But the fact that USC has another national championship, and again, these were all convoluted, but when you look at the head-to-heads, 11-7-2 against Notre Dame, and then you look at USC going head-to-head against Alabama 2-2 and beat them 2 times down in Alabama at critical times. Yeah, I'm biased, but I think the numbers and the facts, and hopefully I laid them out today and kind of took you back to history. Maybe you learned some. I know I learned a few things today as well, but I would leave it at this. It would have been great if there was a +1 at the end of the '79 season. That's what it should have happened.
And that is another series I would like to dive into, would be creating a +1 throughout all the years
That would be awesome.
from 1998 going back, or 1997 going back. That would be phenomenal. Some years it was easy to do. Other years it would have been difficult to determine what that +1 would have been.
Like 73 was crazy.
Yeah.
And
77 is crazy. Even though the polls made it a clear Notre Dame with a 4 touchdown. And I get it. When you watch Notre Dame, competing for a national title, and Texas is the number one consensus number one team, and Notre Dame beats them by 4 touchdowns on New Year's Day. I get the vote, and I'm not always criticizing the voters, because think about it. I look at a lot of years and say these 3 teams, 1983, Miami, Nebraska, Auburn, deserve a share of a national championship. But if you're sitting there with a top 20 ballot or a top 25 ballot, I say top 20, people think I messed up. No, it was a top 20 ballot at the time.
Yep.
And you could only write in one team. Now, there were split votes, but I wouldn't want to do that myself. And so those voters were pressed into. And it was almost like in certain years, like 1991 with Washington, Miami, and 97 with Michigan, Nebraska. I don't think it was coordinated, but it was almost like it was coordinated. Like, you guys vote for one, we'll vote for the other. It should be split, and that's what we'll do.
Well, and that's why, if you take a look at it, and this is just my opinion, when USC won the 78 coaches poll, right? Alabama won the AP, but the coaches, I think, they knew how hard it was to go into Alabama and beat Bear Bryant. Okay, that's not just the best win of the year, but possibly, the past 20 years. And I'm not being crazy for saying that. But I mean, look, it took 34 more years to do it. And even better coach with Nick Saban. So that doesn't happen all the time. And granted, Penn State started at number 3, but they didn't really beat anybody in the 20 years. Sorry, Penn State fans, but facts are facts. And that's part of the challenge that they had being an independent, was trying to gain that respect, and a la Boise State, or a la ASU before they joined the Pac-8 to become the Pac-10 in 78. So.
Yeah, Penn State's an interesting situation, because I can empathize with 1968, 69, 73 undefeated seasons and not being named a national champion, but the schedule just does not compare to the other teams. Now, to their credit, they showed up at an Orange Bowl in those seasons and beat somebody really good, but it was it was their one shot, and they delivered, but they just don't have the schedules. And it's really strange because of the evolution of the conferences and the independent teams, is that Penn State, when I started watching, soon after I started watching into the early 80s, Penn State then had some of the tougher schedules in the country. The way Miami was on their schedule, and they got better. They would schedule Nebraska and Alabama, and the teams in the East, a lot of them became better, Maryland and Pitt and others, and they had really tough schedules when I remember watching Penn State football during the 80s. We appreciate the super chat, Michael. Thank you so much for that. Michael says, for what it's worth, 1973, my Houston Cougars finished 11-1 and beat the likes of Virginia Tech, Miami, Florida State, South Carolina, and a few others. So wasn't chumps. No, not at all. 11-1 for Houston. Lost to Auburn on the road, 7-0. That Auburn team was a number 11 team at the time. I don't know what they finished. In 1973, though, Michael, when you're citing teams like Florida State, that sounds good, but Florida State, now that looks good, doesn't it? On the super chat there, Rick, Florida State used to be. Florida State was 0-11.
Oh, yeah, that was I think before Bobby Bowden. Yeah, I think Bobby Bowden was at West Virginia at the time, and Miami looks good too. But that's a team that Alabama played a lot in the 60s, was Miami. But it looks good today, but it wasn't so good back then.
Well, Michael's telling us they beat the likes of Miami, and they were good. Miami went 5-6.
Yeah.
And these teams were playing each other. They weren't playing really good schedules. So, Michael, thank you so much for the contribution. And yes, we appreciate your passion for Houston football. And it is a interesting football legacy and history that Houston has. And the great, of course, quarterback play in the 1980s and 90s. And again, entering the Big 12. It'll be interesting to see if Houston can keep some of that talent home and compete. But yeah, 1973, 11-1. And then we've got Shoelace Sooner. Thank you so much for that. We appreciate you. I know I'm biased, but I'll give OU the 70s. Yeah, if we were going to split it up 60s and 70s, then it becomes a different component to a certain extent. Although USC, Alabama, Ohio State, certainly, those three were, and Notre Dame really took it all the way through those 2 decades, start to finish, pretty much as dominant programs. And Oklahoma and Nebraska. All right, Rick, appreciate you doing this and putting this together for us. It was a good time.
Hey, I enjoyed doing it, Mark. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate you. And good luck with the rest of May, the Great Debate Month. I look forward to tuning in to a few more episodes.
All right, everyone, keep it locked in here at the Voice of College Football. We've got plenty of content coming your way, plenty of live streams. So again, please subscribe and hit the bell for the notifications. That way you know when we go live with our next live stream. And we'll see you next time right here at the Voice of College Football.